Look at southern Niger from space today, and you will see something that should not exist. Across roughly 5 million hectares of the Sahel, the brown is gone. In its place, an estimated 200 million trees, scattered through the farmland of the Maradi and Zinder regions, dense enough that satellites can map them from orbit. This is one of the largest environmental transformations on Earth, and almost nobody planted it. That last part is the strange part, because for 30 years before this, Niger tried to plant its way out of the desert, and almost every single tree it put in the ground died. Rewind to the 1970s and early 80s. The Sahel, that vast belt of dry land sitting right below the Sahara, was collapsing. The desert seemed to be marching south, swallowing villages a field at a time. Drought came and stayed, and came again. Crops withered in the ground. The topsoil, the thin living layer that grows everything, lifted off the bare fields and blew away in dust storms thick enough to blot out the sun. Wells dropped, animals died, and in the worst years, so did people. So aid agencies arrived in Niger with a plan that sounded completely obvious. If the land has no trees, plant trees. Trees would block the wind, hold the soil, bring back the rain. So that is exactly what they did. Millions of seedlings, grown in nurseries, trucked out across the country, dug into the sand by hand under a punishing sun, and the desert ate them. Scarcely 10% of those seedlings survived. The heat cooked them in the soil. The dust storms shredded the tender leaves. The roaming goats found the green shoots and grazed them down to nothing in a single afternoon. And the rare few that fought their way to head height were often chopped down for firewood within a season, because families cooking over open fires needed wood more than they needed a promise of shade in 10 years. Picture the scale of that waste. Thousands of workers, truckloads of seedlings, year after year after year. And the Sahel stayed brown. By the early 80s, after roughly 30 years of failed planting projects, a quiet, defeated consensus had settled in. A lot of serious, well-meaning people had decided that Niger simply could not be reforested, that the land was too far gone, that you cannot grow a forest in a desert no matter how hard you try. They were wrong about one thing, and it would turn out to be the only thing that mattered. One of those people was about to change his mind on the side of a road. His name was Tony Ronaldo, a young Australian agronomist who had come to Niger to fight the desert. For years, he had been running the same kind of tree planting program everyone else ran, and he had watched it fail the same way everyone else watched it fail. The seedlings he raised so carefully kept dying in the sand. He grew so discouraged that he began to think the entire mission was hopeless, that he had given years of his life to a problem with no solution. Then one ordinary day, driving a load of seedlings across the dry land, he stopped his vehicle to let some air out of his tires so they would grip the sand better. And while he stood there in the heat, he looked down at what he had spent years dismissing as just another useless desert bush. It was not a bush. When he actually looked at it, really studied the leaves and the woody little stems, he realized those scrubby shoots coming out of the ground were not weeds at all. They were tree sprouts. They were growing back from the stumps and the root systems of trees that had been cut down years, even decades, before. And in that moment, the whole landscape rearranged itself in his mind. The trees of Niger were not dead. They had been felled and cleared and burned off the surface. But underneath the soil, the roots were still alive, still pushing up new growth, season after season, while everyone ignored them and bought more nursery seedlings. All across that brown, supposedly lifeless land, there was a forest already waiting. An underground forest, hidden in plain sight, under everybody's feet. Remember this, because it is the hinge the entire story turns on, and it is going to come back at the very end. The most valuable resource in Niger was not in any nursery. It was already in the ground. Hold on to that idea, because it is the whole story. The trees were never gone. They had just been cut to the ground. This is the moment everything turns. Because if the roots are already alive, then the hardest part of growing a tree, getting it to take hold in brutal soil, is already done. You do not need to plant anything. You need to stop killing what is already trying to grow. That insight became a method, and the method got a plain, almost boring name. Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, or FMNR. Say that name a few times, because it quietly became one of the most successful environmental ideas of the last century. And the idea behind it is almost embarrassingly simple. Instead of planting new seedlings, a farmer walks across his own field and finds the living stumps already hidden in it. From each stump, he selects a few of the strongest, straightest stems, sometimes 5 or so, and he prunes away the rest. He protects the stems he kept from goats, and from fire. Then he does the hardest part of all. He waits and he lets them grow. Because the root system feeding that stem is not a fragile newborn. It is decades old, deep, and already adapted to this exact brutal soil. So it pushes that chosen stem upward far faster than any pampered nursery seedling could ever hope to manage. A farmer can have a real tree in a few years instead of fighting and failing to start one from scratch. So here's the one thing the farmers of Niger changed. They stopped planting trees. They started regenerating the trees that were already there. You would think a method this cheap and this fast would spread overnight. It did not. At first, it spread to almost no one, because Renato ran straight into resistance, and not the kind you would expect. Part of it was the law itself. For generations, the rule across much of Niger was that trees belonged to the state, not to the farmer whose field they stood on. So a farmer who let trees grow back was nurturing something he might not legally be allowed to keep, prune, or harvest, and might even be fined over later. From his side, protecting trees was all risk and no reward. And part of it was simple: lifelong habit. These farmers and their fathers and their grandfathers had spent their entire lives clearing land to grow food. A clean, bare field was a good field. To them, a tree sprouting in the middle of a millet plot was a weed, a thief stealing water and shade from the crop that fed the family. So when a foreign agronomist showed up and told them to stop clearing and let the bush grow back, it sounded insane. Letting your field go scrubby looked like pure laziness, even shameful failure, in front of the whole watching village. So in 1983, after all of it, Tony Renato could convince only about 10 farmers in the entire region to even try his strange idea. 10. Against 30 years of certainty that nothing could grow here. But here's the turn. Those first fields worked. The regenerated trees came back fast, and they did not steal the harvest the way everyone feared. They did the opposite. The trees broke the wind that had been flaying the topsoil. Their leaves fell and fed the soil. Their roots held moisture. And one species spreading across the Sahel, an acacia called Phaidherbia, did something almost magical. It drops its leaves in the rainy season, so it shades the crops in the dry months and gets out of their way exactly when the millet and sorghum need the sun. The fields with trees grew more food, not less. That changed the argument completely. This was no longer charity. This was a farmer making his own land more productive, for free, using what was already underground. And a famine helped force the issue. In the mid-1980s, drought and hunger hammered the region. Farmers practicing this regeneration found their fields more sheltered, their soil more alive, their harvests more resilient than their neighbors. People noticed. In a place where everyone is watching whose field survives, a working field is the most powerful advertisement there is. So it spread the way nothing imposed from outside ever spreads. Farmer to farmer. One man shows his cousin. The cousin shows the next village. There was no army of foresters, no fleet of trucks, no nursery. The cost ran about $20 per hectare, mostly just the labor of pruning and the discipline of protecting the shoots, and a quiet but crucial shift in the rules, recognizing that farmers could own and benefit from the trees on their land, removed the last reason to keep cutting. Now picture that small change multiplying across an entire country for 2 decades. By the 2000s, the scale had become almost impossible to believe. Roughly 5 million hectares of southern Niger had been transformed. To put that in plain terms, that is an area larger than many entire countries, regreened not by a government program or a corporation, but by ordinary farmers protecting what was already in their soil. An estimated 200 million trees now stood on farmland that had been bare brown earth within living memory, land that the experts had written off as desert. And this is the part that silences the skeptics, the part that makes Niger different from a feel-good story you have to take on faith. You can see it from orbit. Researchers pulled satellite imagery of the Maradi and Zinder regions and compared the same ground across the decades, and the change is undeniable. Where the older images show pale, empty fields, the newer ones show tree cover thickening across millions of hectares of working farmland, a visible green haze of canopy spreading over the Sahel. This was not a hopeful estimate scribbled on a clipboard. It was a change large enough to alter the surface of the planet, recorded by satellites that do not care about anyone's optimism. The human numbers matter just as much as the trees, maybe more. Farmers across these regions reported roughly 50,000 more tons of grain harvested, with the benefits of the regreened land reaching around 2.5 million people. Think about what that actually means on the ground. More firewood for cooking, gathered from pruned branches without ever destroying the forest that produced them. More fodder to keep animals alive through the dry season. More wild foods and fruit and medicine from species that had nearly vanished. And crucially, more food on the table in the very worst drought years, the years that used to mean famine. A landscape that had spent decades exporting its own soil into the sky as dust was now holding that soil down, soaking up the rain, and feeding the people who lived on it. The man who noticed those sprouts on the roadside became known as the Forest Maker. In 2018, Tony Ronaldo received the Right Livelihood Award, often called the Alternative Nobel Prize, honored for demonstrating on a large scale how drylands can be greened at minimal cost, improving the livelihoods of millions of people. He has always insisted he did not make a single tree. He just helped people see the forest that was already under their feet. If you are getting something out of this, the regeneration of one of the harshest places on Earth, then take 1 second to subscribe, because the next stories on this channel are exactly this kind of comeback, and you will not want to miss where this leads. Imagine what other dead places are not actually dead. That is really the lesson hiding inside Niger. For 30 years, the whole world assumed the trees were gone, and the only answer was to start over from a seed. The truth was that the answer was already alive in the ground, and it only needed people to stop fighting it. Today, that same regeneration is spreading across the Sahel, from Senegal eastward, on tens of millions of hectares, all built on one quiet refusal to keep planting and a decision to protect what was already there. And if a nation can bring back a forest it thought it had killed, the next question is what else we have written off too soon. Next, we are going to Kenya, where people raised 300 orphaned elephants and released them back into the wild. And what those elephants did next is something almost no one expected. Subscribe, and I will see you there.